Good afternoon. Welcome to this event of the Explorers. This month, Explorers has been very busy. This is our third event, but this is a very special event. We have been talking with Claudia Roesch, I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, for almost a year, and Jennifer Rodgers, who both of them I will introduce in a second, have agreed to do this interview with us. So we're going to have a conversation with them. Then I will upload the video to our Vimeo channel and to social media, and then you can get in touch. If you want to get in touch with them for any questions, email me and I will give you their emails. So our event today is called Amor sin temor, Love Without Fear, Planning and Counseling Latinx Families in the Post-War United States. Claudia Roesch is a research fellow at the German Historical Institute, Washington, and associated postdoc at the University of Constance. Her research interests include the history of knowledge, gender and the family, history of sexuality, and migration history in a transatlantic perspective. She received her PhD in contemporary history from the University of Munster in 2014, and her publications include Macho Man and Modern Woman, Mexican Immigration, Social Experts, and Changing Family Values in the 20th Century United States. I'm super interested in that, by the way. Her recent publications include A Contested Pill, Transnational Controversies over Medical Abortion in Germany, France, and the United States, in the Journal of Contemporary History. And her current research project deals with ONIT, intentional settlements in the mid-19th century Atlantic world. I didn't read the publications in Germany, Claudia, because I don't speak German. But if people are interested, I can put that in the chat or let them know which are your publications in German. And we have with us also Jennifer L. Rodgers. She's an assistant research professor of history at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, where she also serves as an editor of the Einstein Papers Project. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Rodgers is currently completing a manuscript based on her dissertation titled The Archives of Humanity, the International Tracing Service, the Holocaust and Post-War Order for Oxford University Press. Her second book project explores childbirth and obstetrics in Germany from 1945 to 2000. In 2023 and 2024, Dr. Rodgers has several articles and pieces of public writing coming out that deal with the International Tracing Service, childbirth of obstetrics, and Einstein. Her personal research broadly deals with humanitarianism and human rights, archives, the aftermath of Nazism, as well as the histories of medicine and gender. So welcome. Thank you very much for accepting the Explorers invitation, and the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jimena, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you and then pass on to Jennifer, who I also thank for coming up with the questions and giving me the opportunity to talk about my project. So yeah, let's just move over.
Well, Jimena, thank you for organizing this event. I'm really excited to be here. And Claudia, thank you for thinking of me to interview you. Claudia and I have been on many panels together, and this is a new format for us. And I'm really, really excited to be doing this. And actually, we're able to have a conversation about your really, really interesting research that in many ways overlaps with a lot of my own research interests. So thank you for entrusting me with your research, Claudia. Why don't I start with a relatively easy question? And Claudia, you specifically chose the title Amor sin temor, Love Without Fear. And I'm curious, and I'm sure other people will be curious, why you chose that particular title. And can you tell us a little bit more about the genesis of it? It's, at least for me, pretty unexpected origins, and any other reasons that you might have chosen this title.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind question. And let me start my screen share so I can show you why I chose this question. Here we go. And the basic story is that I was doing archival research in the Planned Parenthood archive, and I found this comic that was commissioned by Planned Parenthood to Marvel Comics to create a brochure about family planning as a comic book in both English and Spanish. And so I found that very interesting, and I chose this title. I had chosen this title for a publication because I thought it was really interesting to see, on the one hand, how the brochure is targeting working class people, and also how it is targeting Latinx people. What are the differences? What are the similarities? And as you can see from the title, the images are very similar, and the story is the same. So in the English version, it's a couple called Joan and Ken. In the Spanish version, it's Marta and Joaquin. And the basic story is the couple gets into a fight because the woman doesn't want to have any more children and refuses to have sexual intercourse with her husband. So the next day, the husband is at work, has an accident at work, and then talks to the doctor, who then advises him to go to a Planned Parenthood clinic. So he convinces his wife, and then she goes to a Planned Parenthood clinic where she is advised by a female doctor about different contraceptives. And in the end, they reconcile, and they're a happy family of 5. And so, I used this title because I thought this comic book was so interesting, because of the narratives that it conveys about the concept of family planning in the 60s, that family planning can enable social mobility, but also that working class and Latinx families are conceived as being too large, also about gender roles, and the way that Planned Parenthood activists think about how they can reach those families.
Okay, great. Thank you. Before I start to ask kind of some more meatier substantive questions about the research, could you tell us a little bit about how you came to this topic and how you've seen it develop over time?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I came across the topic of Latinx families and Latinx gender norms already as an undergrad when I gave a class presentation on Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera. And then when I was applying for grad school, my master's thesis advisor told me about a colleague of hers, Isabel Heinemann, who then became my PhD advisor. And she was looking for people who were doing research on changing family values in the US. So I suggested a project on Mexican immigrant families. And in the end, I wrote my PhD about how social work that was reaching out to Mexican immigrant families perceived Mexican origin families and how that changed. And so doing that research, I came across a quote from a 1930s sociologist called Emory Esbogados, who said that Americans plan their families, whereas Mexicans think of many children as a gift of God. And so when Isabella and me were looking for a postdoc project that would fit into the research center in Münster on cultures of decision making, we thought about this quotation and actually came up with a pretty large project about reproductive decision making. So how decisions about how many children to have, when to have children, how those were made in different cultures. In the end, the German Research Foundation cut our project, so we ended up doing a comparative project between Germany and the US. And of course, both Germany and the US are rather diverse societies. So I was always interested in keeping the sort of minority or immigrant perspective in the project. So that's why I continued to focus on Latinx families in the US and looked out for material on immigrant families in Germany.
That's really interesting. It's unfortunate that the funding ran out for the larger project too, because I think it would have been really fascinating. One of the things that both you and I know is there is a really, really wide literature about reproductive rights in Germans or in scholarship about Germany, but kind of some of the more nuanced themes, reproductive knowledge networks, childbirth and obstetrics, which is what I work on. They're gaps in the scholarship on that. So it's hopefully you'll be able to develop that a little bit further in the future. I guess I'm also curious, just to kind of go back to the title again, can you tell us how this Amor sin temor fits into your research as a whole? And I think kind of on the surface, the cases of how reproductive knowledge is disseminated in Native American communities, which I find very fascinating, and Mexican American immigrant communities, as well as within minority groups in West Germany, they don't seem particularly comparable. And in West Germany, you were dealing largely with guest workers from places like Italy, Morocco, and Turkey. And I think one of the really interesting things that you've been able to show in your research is that there are a lot of striking parallels between the two contexts. And as I said, I think this fills a very important gap in the scholarship, particularly for West Germany. So can you elaborate a little bit more on the parallels between the two cases in the United States and in West Germany? And do you have any information on East Germany? I would be curious to hear that as well. And can you also tell us a little bit more about why this is so significant to our understanding of how women gained knowledge about their reproductive options and their reproductive rights?
Yeah, so I'll start out with the first part of the question. So sort of the striking similarities are that both Puerto Rican and Mexican immigrants in the United States and the Southern and Eastern European immigrants in West Germany, they came through so-called guest worker programs. So Mexican immigrants, Puerto Rican immigrants came with a Bracero program in the 1940s. And the guest worker programs in Germany started in 1955. And the idea in both programs was that it's going to be male workers. The Bracero program actually didn't allow the contracting of women, and that those male workers, they were going to stay for a while, maybe 5 years, and then return home to their families. And of course, what happened in both programs is that men brought along their families, along their partners, met women in their host country. In the guest worker programs in West Germany, both men and women could be contracted. So a lot of couples formed while they were working in Germany, and then they decided to stay for good. And so the difference is that Planned Parenthood in the US already was very much concerned with the so-called hyperfertility, or what they called overpopulation concern regarding Mexican immigrants. So they started to target Mexican immigrants already in the 40s. In the West German case, family planning associations, they pretty much ignored migrant workers until 1976, when the abortion law was reformed, and all of a sudden migrant women started to show up in their pregnancy crisis counseling, because in Germany it's mandated that if you want to have an abortion, you need to have a proof that you underwent counseling first. And so that made Pro Familia, so that's the German Family Planning Association, their counselors aware that there's actually a need among immigrant women for contraceptive information, for reproductive knowledge, and they started to study these women. They hired a group of sociologists who actually went into the Turkish families, interviewed them, and they found out that these women, you have knowledge on reproductive practices, and they receive this knowledge through a mixture of formal, semi-formal, and informal networks in both their home country and their chosen countries. So by formal networks, I refer to professional counselors like doctors, social workers, lawyers. With semi-formal groups, I understand advocacy groups, so that can be groups like Planned Parenthood, but also feminist women's health clinics. And they were very compassionate to these women, but they of course also had a political agenda, and with regards to family planning associations, also a population control bias. And sort of the third, that's the informal networks. What I mean with that is those are neighbors, relatives, friends, co-workers, both in their own communities, but also with like co-workers in their companies. And yeah, and so they used all three networks. They continued to see doctors, OBGYNs in their home countries. So for instance, the German family counselors were surprised to find out that Turkish origin women went back to Turkey for abortions or would get Depo-Provera, which wasn't on the German market yet in Turkey. So yeah, these sort of, there's a mixture of formal and informal networks in a transnational setting.
Can I ask you a question also related to the title before advancing?
Sure.
Okay, I am from Colombia, Claudia, as I mentioned before. Well, as I mentioned you before, I think like a year ago, and I am very curious also about the title Amor sin temor, because having my Latin American background, when I read the title, I related it also like, I mean, sometimes in Latin America, love is very associated with many kinds of machismo, as you mentioned in your other papers. So I was also like trying to understand if this was also referred like to Planned Parenthood strategies, or also with the fear that sometimes women have in their marriages with machismo. And that also came to mind because in Colombia, Pro Familia is the name of the institution that takes care of that. So can you tell me a little bit more about that? It's just curiosity.
Yeah, sure. So machismo, that is actually something that gets picked up in the 1960s by cultural anthropologists and sociologists who study Mexican American families that live in the US Southwest, and they very much pick on the theme of machismo. And so there are Planned Parenthood brochures. Let me see if I find one. So for instance, this one, they very much, well, I didn't put the page on there, but they very much use the term machismo. Like they say, like, el jefe de la familia decide cuántos niños tienen. And so they very much sort of present these decision-making networks in the family in a way that's also the case in the comic, is that the husband needs to be convinced to use contraceptive, to practice family planning. So they very much engage with that. And with regards to the Colombian Pro Familia, I think it's a coincidence that both the German and the Colombian Family Planning Association are called Pro Familia. There's a scholar, Teresa Hule, who has written a book on the Colombian Family Planning Association. I think it's also somewhere behind me. And there's actually some connection between the two, because the president of the German Family Planning Association travels to Colombia in the 60s. He travels to Chile and then makes a tour around Latin America. And there he picks up some brochures and decides that have been designed by Planned Parenthood in the US for Spanish-speaking audiences in both the US and in Latin America. And then he decided, let's translate those pamphlets into German so that we can pass this on among working class women in Germany. So they are connected to IPPF, so the International Planned Parenthood Federation. And there is this exchange between the family planning associations.
Thank you.
That answer very nicely dovetails into my next question about transnational knowledge networks, which is something that both of us are very, very interested in. And in the case of my own research on childbirth and obstetrics in West and in East Germany, there's an incredible amount of knowledge exchange between the United States and West Germany. And that's something that you just brought up in your own answer. The kind of Latin America trip of the Pro Familia representative is also really, really interesting when you're thinking about the Cold War. There's definitely kind of Cold War competition in those geographic contexts to gain basically a reproductive rights foothold over their communist counterparts. So in West Germany in particular, birth activists model their efforts for change, and this is the same thing that you basically just said about these pamphlets, which included more informal knowledge networks. They do them on American initiatives. In the case of obstetrics, gynecology, and childbirth, they model it on the Feminist Women's Health Center here in LA. But I'm also thinking in terms of the very progressive women's birthing clinic in El Paso during the 1970s. So I wonder, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about not only what was going on in Latin America, but if you know of any other specific exchanges that go on in formal, semi-formal, and informal networks between doctors in these migrant communities in the United States and in West Germany?
Yeah, so now that you brought up,
sorry.
I mean, it's a very big question, but now that you brought up the Cold War context, let me start with an anecdote. And so Pro Familia is the West German Family Planning Association, but until 1968, Karl-Heinz Mehlan, who's the leader of the family planning movement in East Germany, is actually a member. So Margaret Sanger, she actually advertises the connection to the German Pro Familia as a sort of a gateway into beyond the Iron Curtain, so into Eastern Europe. And regarding the networks between Latinx communities, there's actually the interesting case about a Puerto Rican family planner called Ofelia Mendoza, and she travels to New York to help Planned Parenthood reach Puerto Rican immigrant communities in New York. She creates a very sophisticated brochure, also in Spanish, and then she also visits West Germany in the early 60s to teach the West German family planners how to reach working class women, and there's always a connection from the German side towards the US, and that you have that on the level of the family planning associations, but then later also with the women's movement. So for instance, in Berlin, there's the Feminist Women's Health Center. They very much take, they learn from Carol Downer from Los Angeles. There's a lot of caseworkers in Pro Familia and in feminist health centers who have been exchange students in California and saw different health centers in the US. So there's a constant exchange, and in a way they model their initiative, especially when it comes to women's health, on the US American experience, but they also sort of bringing their own perspective. So the West German women's movement is much more politicized in a way. So they quote Marxist theory much more than the American women's health movement does. But at the same time, they're rather unaware of the special situation of racialized minorities. So they only learn that from the US American feminists. So sort of the question revolving around sterilization and sterilization abuse, or why Depo-Provera or the IUD might be problematic. So that's definitely something that comes out of the US women's health movement, and also different mobilization strategies, the know-how on how to run a feminist women's health center and stuff like that.
A shorter question here that I'd also really like to ask you is, can you tell us about the differences in the way the pamphlets are written? So the ones aimed at Latin communities in the United States and the way they're written in German, because I know that you've looked specifically at the language that's used, and there's a really big and very interesting difference in how the Americans approach it and how the Germans approach it.
Yes, there is. So let me move my slides. So this is a brochure that Pro Familia produces for Turkish, Spanish, Greek, Italian, and Croatian immigrants. And the language is very different. So let me see if I find the slide. So here, for instance, that's the first pamphlet that's been produced for Spanish-speaking audiences in the US, and you can see it's a very simple language. So it says muchos niños, and to me, I mean, I'm not a Spanish native speaker, but to me it sounds like it's very much translated directly from English. And a lot of these brochures use a very simple language, and they use a lot of euphemisms. And the brochures, as you could see with the comics, they're entertaining. They have also the pamphlets that are addressed towards English-speaking audiences. They often use comics, and they use a lot of drawings. Whereas the German brochures, first of all, Pro Familia doesn't have that much money, so they don't have such elaborate designs. But they also use different translators. So they use Iberian Spanish, or they use terms that are being directly translated from German. So for instance, the Spanish language pamphlet Planificación Familiar Porque y Como, they talk about using an espiral, which is like a weird translation of the German term Spirale for IUD, which I don't think anybody in a Spanish-speaking country uses. But these brochures, they are much more sophisticated in the sense that they present all the different available contraceptives, and they show photographs of all of them. Also, they show the children, so they center very much on children, whereas the US or the pamphlets produced in the US, they're very much focused on showing the nuclear family and the parents. And but also I have to say, those are of course from 1979, so they are produced after the women's movement and the women's health movement had an effect on family planning institutions. And so this was very much an initiative driven by feminists within Pro Familia that produced these brochures. So they were very much cautious to produce better written and more informative brochures than those brochures that were produced by Planned Parenthood in the 60s. So there's also, a 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Can I say something very quick about the language? It
Yeah.
was curious. well, in Spanish from Colombia, you know that all Latin American countries have different slangs for Spanish, but in like an old Spanish from Colombia, there was a particular device, a contraceptive device that we called el churrusco, and churrusco was a spiral thing like this. But it's very old. I don't think they use it anymore, and the word is not used anymore. So it's just
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, but it probably is the same where the German term Spirale for IUD derives from. But yeah, that's interesting.
I think in the United States, in some cases, it's like referred to as a copper coil.
Yeah.
On that, because I'm not a historian of the United States. I guess I would probably say I dabble in American history. But yeah, I think that it's referred to as the copper coil, which is the exact same concept. So, Jimena, did you have anything else that you wanted to?
No. It was just that I was curious about the language thing, like the same concept, but it has so different like implications in every context. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. Claudia, you've mentioned a couple of times the women's movement and the women's health movement, and in both the US and West Germany, they're so crucial to kind of upending these very gendered medical technical hierarchies that underpinned reproductive rights and options for decades. Really, that all kind of galvanizes as medicine professionalizes at the end of the 19th century, and then really begins to kind of coalesce into in Germany at least, coalesce into a doctor-centric, a physician-centric focus, and accommodating what doctors wanted, so not so much on women. I guess I'm curious, how did the women's movement and the women's health movement change how groups like Planned Parenthood and Pro Familia, how did it change how they approached migrant communities? And kind of dovetailing off of that, one of the things that I find really interesting in your work is that there's this emphasis on becoming a clean middle-class family with fewer children. And I'm wondering how shifting social structures reframed those normative socioeconomic tropes.
Yeah, so starting out with the way that the women's movement, the women's health movement changed family planning association. So I can say more about the West German case here. So basically what happens is that in the 1970s, Pro Familia builds up many more family planning clinics when they start taking part in these trials to establish pregnancy crisis counseling, and they hire a lot of new staff. And this staff, these are all very young social workers, OBGYNs, and that come from very progressive universities that have been part of the student movement, of the women's movement. So it's a generational shift, and also a sort of a shift in backgrounds from being a medically driven institution to being an institution that's more driven by social workers. And so these new, younger, more feminist counselors, they bring a change within the organization, that they demand a complete legalization of abortion, and that they also bring in feminist forms of knowledge production, feminist forms of conversation, so that, for instance, when they do this research among the Turkish immigrant families in Berlin, they very much chose an approach that resembles consciousness raising as a feminist practice. So they invite women that to the home of one Turkish origin woman. And then they first start out with asking general questions, ask every woman to tell her story, her experience with getting birth control, with reproductive needs, experiences of discrimination. And through that conversation, they figure out what are the needs in the community, and then they refer these women to the family planning clinic. So it's a very much, a much more bottom-up approach, a grassroots community approach, where it's the translators who do most of the talking. And so sort of it's a much more community-inspired approach that they take compared to sort of the approaches that family planners were taking in the 60s. And yeah, I think Planned Parenthood was a bit slower to change, but they also adapted, also within the context of sort of the abortions right movement and positioning themselves as clearly pro-choice, working together with different women's organizations in that. And that also, what I think is very important for the US case is that you have the feminisms of women of color, so Chicana feminism, Black feminism, Asian American, Native American feminism, and these women's movements, they all bring about or make the public aware of sterilization abuse and abuse of long-acting reversive contraceptives, so-called LARCs. And that really shifts the debate in the US in the early 80s. It's Planned Parenthood then is a bit more towards the conservative side, but groups like the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, they very much take those women of color, minority women serious, and include their grievances into their own books and their own publications. So yeah, now you have to remind me of the second part of your question.
Oh, just basically how these shifting social structures reframed a lot of the normative socioeconomic tropes. Because one of the things that I, in reading your work that comes up a lot is this notion of a clean, which in and of itself is absolutely fascinating, a clean middle class family, clean middle class nuclear family. Kind of how are those the shifting familial norms influencing that as well?
Yes, I like how you say the clean middle class family, because that is very much tied to sort of an idea of respectability. So in the 1950s, you have Planned Parenthood brochures saying like, advertising that even families who are affected with an STI should come into Planned Parenthood counseling and get treatment, and sort of that they have a chance to become this clean middle-class family if they get treatment. And yeah, that's very prevalent in the 50s and 60s. And especially in the US case, where you have sort of this very prevalent idea of the white middle-class nuclear family, and sort of and that's a narrative that's especially aimed at Latinx families. It's not aimed at African-American families, but sort of this aspirational story of, I have this film brochure here. So sort of the idea that if you plan your families, you can, if you only have 3 kids, you can send your kids to college, and then your kids can rise into the middle classes. That's a very strong narrative here. And that, of course, that also changes, especially through the activism of women of color, of feminists of color, the rise, especially Black feminists, who sort of shift the debate from reproductive choice to reproductive justice, pointing out that it's not just a question of choice or of rights, but also of the socioeconomic circumstances that influence a woman's decision whether to have children, how many children to have, and also pointing out the role of racism, the role of class, and also the idea that it's of course also part of being pro-choice, sort of to have the choice to have 5 or 10 children And so, yeah, so that's a shift that's starting to happen in the 80s and goes into the 1990s. But yeah, but that's definitely a shift that comes in through the voices of women of color.
Okay, that's really interesting. One of the aspects of reproduction and childbirth that I have found very fascinating, and that you've touched on here as well, is this return to more informal forms of knowledge sharing, if you will. So in thinking of the case of childbirth, up until about 1950, women learned about childbirth from other women. And then the importance of those networks changed and was largely suppressed as both professionalized and programmed gynecology and obstetrics kind of took over everything, and women were increasingly giving birth in hospitals. They were getting their obstetric care in hospitals as well. But then when the women's health movement moves to recenter women in those healthcare choices, we start to see those two types of knowledge gradually meld together. They converge. So can you tell us a little bit more about the tension between those two types of networks, and how they ultimately converged to ensure that women and men were educated about all of their reproductive rights and choices?
Yeah, yeah. First of all, I think the timeline that you give also very much fits to the distribution of knowledge on family planning methods. So up until the 50s, it's very much spread through or disseminated through informal networks. And in the 50s, what especially Planned Parenthood does is sort of campaigning to say those informal networks are dangerous. So you find a lot of 1950s and 1960s literature that says, like, don't listen to your well-meaning neighbor. So it's always a well-meaning neighbor that's sort of the problematic figure in those brochures. But at the same time, they use like the sort of narratives of decision-making that they present in like this film script or the comic book, is they use these informal networks to disseminate knowledge about the existence of family planning clinics. So for instance, here in the film La Sortija de Compromiso, it's actually the neighbor who informs the female protagonist about the existence of a Planned Parenthood clinic. But sort of the idea is that the information that is being transmitted or distributed in those networks is dangerous, and that information that is given in family planning clinics or by doctors is by experts is better. It's rational, it's scientific. And then I think what the major turning point is in 1970, the hearings on the safety of the pill. Barbara Seaman's book, The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, comes out in 1969. And here it's this is a mobilization point for the women's movement, the beginning of the women's health movement, that they start to show that also these formal networks are not reliable. So that there is that doctors keep information on side effects and on potential risks of oral contraceptives from women, and yeah, that these information are also not reliable, that doctors are patronizing, condescending. And then those women's health handbooks come out, so written by women's health activists, and they take up that in sort of the information that they have through informal networks, but at the same time they still keep the scientific knowledge, and they bring those two together. So it's not that for instance, Our Bodies, Ourselves completely rejects all scientific knowledge, but they bring these two types together. And it's especially, I found this very interesting case here about in a Chicana feminist journal about birth preparation classes where they basically say, we take a couple from the community that has had a number of children, and they teach the class, and then they screen Planned Parenthood films and invite Planned Parenthood speakers as guest speakers. So it's sort of a community-based approach that's based on experience, but still they bring in the expert information through films or through guest speakers. And so that's how they conflagate sort of the formal and the informal knowledge.
Okay, interesting. I want to kind of focus in on, we've focused a lot on Latin communities and migrant communities in Germany. And I know that one of the other communities that your work deals with is Native Americans. And really outside of a few studies, including the recent monograph, Reproduction on the Reservation, Native American communities are very often overlooked when we think about reproductive rights and knowledge networks. And you know that I have a particular interest in this question as well, because my own research has uncovered that there's a consistent instrumentalization of the purity of Native American reproductive and birth cultures by West German feminists to promote their own efforts of recentering women in the reproductive health, or in reproductive health as a whole, while they're simultaneously denigrating similar sub-Saharan African birth cultures, and I'm going to steal your term here, as existing in a pre-modern void. So can you tell us a little bit more about how all of this functioned within Native American communities, and how they're similar or how they differ from their Mexican American counterparts? And have you, I guess, another part of that too is, have you been able to discern any differences in the experience of Mexican Americans who are of white Hispanic origin and those who come from indigenous communities?
Mm-hmm. I should say, to be fair, I don't really research Native American communities. I stumbled across them because Planned Parenthood chapters in the Southwest reached out to both Native American and Mexican origin families. And I agree, it's a very understudied topic. So when I was teaching this year, I tried to include a class on reproductive justice and Native Americans and the sterilization abuse that Native Americans bring to the public in the 1970s. But there's very little on it. And I should say that sort of for the experts that I looked at in my PhD dissertation, so there's a lot of sociologists, cultural anthropologists that study Mexican American health race or Mexican American public health in the Southwest in the 50s and 60s because of the high infant mortality rates. And they often mix up Mexican Americans and Native Americans. Yeah, and I mean, those ethnographic studies, they make a difference. So they distinguish between Mexican immigrants, Hispanos, so the sort of the Latinx or Spanish-speaking people of New Mexico that have lived there before Arizona and New Mexico were annexed by the US. And but in practice, they're sort of in the counseling practice, there's no distinction. So often Native Americans that have Spanish names are mistaken for Mexican immigrants, but I really like what you said about the purity of Native American traditions. Is what these ethnographic studies from the 60s often emphasize is that Mexican American health practice are always depicted as a hybrid between Native American practices and European practices from the early modern era. But it's depicted as like, this is pre-modern, but it's pre-modern and hybrid. And so it's not a sort of pure form but a mixture. And I mean, I definitely have to think more about this. And I can't really say that in the brochures or in the text that I saw very much reflection on sort of the difference between white Latinx and indigenous Latinx communities, but there's a distinction that's often being made on the basis of class and of education. So you have like the Latinx educated middle classes that find these brochures very condescending and that complain about it, but at the same time they have a very classicist view on lower class, less educated Spanish-speaking populations as well. And but I mean, as you could see, I think in most of the brochures, they very much depict Latinx families as being white with black hair. So so I don't think there's much a reflection on the question of race.
Okay. I mean, I think we're talking about sources here as well. And that's one of the things in my own work that I've had a difficult time accessing a lot of sources about minority and migrant communities. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the sources that you use and where you found them and how you've accessed accessed them, where you've been able to find them.
So what I did for my PhD dissertation was that I specifically looked at Mexican American civil rights organizations. So to counter sort of the white expert narrative and also the social worker narrative. And so I started out with like LULAC, so the Latin League of United Latin American Citizens. That's the oldest Latinx civil rights association that was founded in Texas in 1929. And I looked at through their journal. I found student newspapers from 1940s Los Angeles, where there was Mexican origin students creating student newspapers. And I found a lot of discussions within the Chicanx movement or Chicana movement, and especially Chicana feminism. And they all address the questions of family in a lot of detail. So that was really a good point to sort of counter the white expat narrative. And for the second book, I struggled a bit more with that because especially for the German case, unfortunately, I don't speak Turkish. So I couldn't really find similar literature there. But I know that right now there's a PhD candidate in Berlin. She's getting her PhD especially on the experience of Turkish immigrants and reproductive rights in Germany, and she speaks Turkish, so she's doing oral history interviews, and so for the second book, I sort of tried to sort of put the expert literature and the feminist literature, so like the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, etc. I put those in conversation with each other.
Okay, really interesting. I'm going to go ahead and end with a very practical question for you. And this is something both of us have thought about, I know. I think there's so many of us who work on topics related to reproductive health, and we're kind of sitting and watching with horror as reproductive rights are under constant attack, and they're being repealed at a breathtakingly rapid rate, not only in the United States, but across the globe. And in most cases, the people who are most affected by the repeal of those laws and by a lot of these reproductive health policies are minority and migrant communities. So how do you think that your research can help us better provide reproductive services to these groups and also enhance tactics for successful activist campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I started out with my PhD, I was very optimistic. I was like, okay, so I'm going to write my book about how social work should be done, that it should be community-centered, that it should be led by the people from the community. And as I said, inviting majority organizations such as Planned Parenthood only for expert talks. Yeah, but of course, this is something that I guess all historians and all academics struggle a bit with, is the visibility. So yeah, I mean, right now I'm fortunate to be in a position here at the GHI that I can do some outreach work on that. I mean, I really enjoyed the panel that we had at the last GSA, where we got experts or activists from the field, from actually reproductive justice organizations in Texas, to work together with us historians. Yeah, I mean, I hope to be part of the conversation. I also hope to sort of get my students to think more about these issues. And yeah, so I guess that's sort of, yeah, my hope to yeah, kind of leave the so-called ivory tower of academia and yeah, get into conversation with activists, but also in a very sort of taking a position of taking a step back and letting the activists or the sort of the experts in the field talk, because I think sort of I mean, I'm not a yeah, I'm not a professional in the field of social work, but it's sort of yeah, very interesting to hear activists talk, present their experience, and then sort of be the one who sort of yeah, distributes this expertise more. And yeah, so yeah, so I mean, I yeah, I guess I don't know, doing outreach work, and also trying to connect, trying to network with people who are doing the actual activist work. I guess sort of that's yeah, that's my way to sort of provide information, provide conceptualization, and also maybe a bigger context, historical context for the debates that are happening right now. I hope that was kind of a satisfying answer.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that either, because that's, I think it's a really, really difficult question to navigate, as you know, as a scholar who works on reproductive rights. So I think maybe to Jimena, or is it Luisa? Do either of you have any questions that you want to ask?
I have a question observation. I mean, the last question you asked, Jennifer, I think was really interesting. I like spot on, like according to the mission of the explorers of the International Federation for Public History is aiming, which is not always easy, to go beyond academia and to be in touch more like with activists and to practice shared authority and be like more public historians. So the example you mentioned, Claudia, with the panel with the activists, I think was great. And I also would like to invite both of you to use this space however you want. I mean, we are open to many kinds of formats, panels. We have done it. I have done this for 3 years now. And we are just like a promotion space. So if you think this space can help you, for example, get the word out there and work with activists, we are very happy in the Federation and for Explorers to do that. So even though you were a little in the spot, I think it's perfect. It's perfect for the Explorers, and we're what we want. And like, I'm very passionate about that, like getting out there and talking with people and with activists, because I'm an anthropologist too. So I just invite you to use the space as however you consider, and I hope we can continue the conversation from now on.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot for the offer, and I mean, definitely have to think about it, and yeah.
Yeah, because I remember you asking me, Claudia, that about public history, And I said, well, I mean, public history could be many things. And this last question is just what public history does.
Yeah.
Going beyond academia and
Yeah.
trying to build bridges for just not being in our ivory tower anymore. So I think it was a great question. I loved it, actually.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's always the sort of the hard question to answer, because we're always expected to do more outreach, to do more citizen science. And I don't know how it is in the US, but in the German sort of context of grant application, you always have to write a paragraph, how you will include sort of the broader public, how you will reach the broader public. And I mean, a lot is being done. I mean, here at the DHI, we organize lecture series, and a lot of things is being done online with like digitization projects. And yeah, so yeah, there's, and yeah, Jennifer?
I mean, I think there is increasingly movement to think about activism and social causes. I mean, the panel that we were on together in Houston at the German Studies Association was something that our colleagues, Tiffany Florville and Eli Rubin thought about we're having this conference in a location where this is a major issue, and how do we as scholars kind of conceptualize, we're giving these talks about reproductive rights in a place where there are effectively no reproductive rights anymore, and then kind of using that and bringing in not only activists but also legal scholars to help us better understand the legal standpoint. Yeah, I think that's increasingly important. I think that it's getting harder and harder for scholars as a whole to kind of be in their own very focused niche and not consider what's going on in the world around them at large. So
yeah, and especially when you work in the history of reproductive rights, to me it felt like sort of events were overtaking me as I was writing this research. So I started out working on this sort of reproductive decision-making project back in 2015. And at that point, I felt like, especially in Germany, that sort of the abortion question was a question that was done, that was decided. And then all of a sudden this, so in Germany, this debate about whether OB-GYNs are allowed to advertise for abortion popped up. Then what's happening here? And so there's these research questions, they have such a strong connection to political debates that are happening right now. And I think sort of we as historians can put these things into historical perspective and show the long-term perspective, and on the one hand show that it's not just a narrative of progress, but also at the same time shows like sort of these are the origins of the debate, and this debate goes so far back. So yeah, I think sort of that's sort of the position that we take in this debate, is sort of giving the larger background. And
and I think one of the things for me that's also really interesting, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a historian of Germany here, so many of the women that pioneered this history were activists themselves. I mean, Barbara Duden is a really, really good example of that. I mean, she was one of the founding members of the Kreuzberg women's group in West Berlin in the late 60s and early 70s. And I mean, she is a very prolific writer on issues related to women and reproductive health. Claudia and I have a colleague who has also written extensively on reproductive rights in Germany, and she commented to both of us recently, here it is 50 years later, and I'm still fighting for this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that there are a lot of continuities there as well. And I mean, we have good models for how scholars can be activists. I mean, obviously, we need to update those according to the times, and getting the word out via social media is something that comes into that as well. So
Yeah.
Yes, and I also think that as historians, well, maybe this is very basic, but as an outsider, I always ask myself, we are in the 21st century already. There are many things going on. There's a lot of women's movements. Why there's still so much resistance and so much to say about women's bodies from other people? That's still something, it's a why that I haven't been able to answer. And sometimes when I answer, I get very passionate about it. So I think it's good to step back also and kind of observe and understand more things. So perhaps we can have an explanation for those kinds of resistances that we think are not happening anymore, but they do. They're very much alive.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, that's what my PhD advisor Isabel and me often talked about, sort of that, that it sort of, it's not just a linear progressive narrative of liberalization, but that there's always contestation and always negotiations, steps going forward, going back. And we once talked about like this describing social change is kind of like a pendulum, sort of that swings back again. And and I think right now we see that a lot. And I mean, I have had this discussion with my students. So I was teaching a class on American gender history at the University of Constance in Germany. And so my students, they are very much, I mean, it's a program for gender studies. So they are very much on the progressive side. And for them, it's really hard to understand sort of these, all these sort of what you said, that sort of these backlashes, and that sort of the idea that women's bodies are still contested, and that's very hard for them to understand. I mean, they see what's going on right now. They see what's going on with, for instance, trans rights or LGBTQ rights, and and so sort of putting these things into perspective and discussing these things in a sort of more longue durée also helps to put sort of the debates that we are having right now and that are going on social media right now into a larger perspective.
I think one of the things that, I mean, it's not that I don't want to say Germany is immune to this, but I mean, it also has an impact on Germans in so far as there is a lot of so-called abortion tourism, particularly from Poland, where Poland has draconian abortion laws. So there are a lot of Polish women who are crossing the borders. There's a scholar, a Polish scholar in Spain, who's actually working on this topic right now, and it's really fascinating to see kind of the continuities of movements in the 60s and the 70s for abortion, and how they've reconstituted themselves over time and are now helping Polish women get out of Poland so that they can get safe abortions in Germany. And in other countries as well. I mean, you have the same thing happening in a lot of cases in the US, like interstate abortion. Tourism, I find tourism a really problematic word, but that's actually what this one's about.
Leslie Regan wrote about it, saying that sort of that's how problematic the term abortion tourism is. Yeah. She suggests using the term reproductive refugees, which I also so I always use the term abortion travels, and what I find, I mean, about the Polish case, sort of in a way, the irony is that Poland, of course, during socialism was a destination for women seeking to have an abortion from Poland, from Sweden, and sort of this is a prime example of like taking, going backwards, having a huge backlash, and of course at the same time, in Germany, the situation is also not in quotation marks, it's not perfect. So there's lots of regions in Germany where you don't have access, especially where you don't have many abortion providers. So and you can only have an abortion unless it's for medical reasons within the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. So there's still German women who travel to the Netherlands to have abortion at a later gestation age. But at the same time, I think the very difference between Germany or Europe and the US is that the distances here are so much bigger. So it's difficult to travel from Poland to Germany or to the Netherlands, but the distances, like going from I don't know, somewhere in central Texas to I think it was Illinois. It's like the first state that doesn't have any abortion restrictions if you go north from Texas. That's a much bigger distance and much more costly, and so there's this and I mean this sort of restriction not only of legal rights but also of abortion access. That's a very problematic thing that I think is happening.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I want to say globally, but in very many cases in the world, very many places in the world.
Yes, I was thinking about the situation in the border with Texas right now. I lived for 7 years in Texas, but now the situation is worse because I have been out of Texas for 3 years. But all the cases of pregnant women by rape in the border that are denied abortions is also a huge issue that nobody addresses, and it could be very dramatic. I know there are certain groups of religious groups and certain NGOs working on that, but I'm not very much updated. But I know it's kind of dramatic. So that could also be like a step to making visible those kinds of issues too. That sometimes is, I mean, not always a pregnancy is welcomed, or it could be, you know what I mean.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
So if you want to wrap it up somehow with a last comment or a last thought.
Well, I can just end by, first of all, thanking Jennifer for coming up with these really nice and fascinating questions, and questions that sort of let me sort of reflect more on my work. And also thank you very much for engaging on such a deep level with the text that I sent you. So I was very thrilled by your questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. And also thank you very much, Jimena, for inviting me. And I mean, even though this was going in a different way than we had planned, it was a really nice conversation. And yeah, it really gave me an opportunity to show some of my favorite source material again. And to talk about some sort of the parts of my project that I really enjoy. And I'm also thrilled that you're so interested in my research. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for putting this together.
Thank you, Claudia. Jennifer?
I don't really have all that much to add, other than to say thank you to both of you for allowing me to participate in this. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot of new stuff in here, and I feel like I also got a lot to chew on in terms of my own research, but also kind of these broader social issues that we're currently dealing with. I mean, I feel like we could probably continue having this conversation for hours on end, going forward. So again, I really just thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Well, I want to thank you both, Claudia and Jennifer, for accepting our invitation of the Explorers. Yes, it didn't go as we planned, but I think it went very, very well. It was very engaging. I am not a historian of reproductive rights, and I was super engaged. I learned a lot, and also made like Jennifer was mentioning, like own reflections, like, oh my God, what can I do about this? Where do I stand? So I think it was really great. And as I mentioned before, I hope it's not the last time. We keep in touch. And well, thank you for being so flexible also for doing this. And my only hope is that you can continue like being part of the Explorers, and I hope to see you again in the future. I will continue doing the Explorers every month. So if you are connected to social media, you will learn about the coming events. And if you have an event in mind, just contact me and we will get it done. And for the people watching this video, if you want to get in touch with Dr. Roesch or Dr. Rodgers, please send me a message and I will give you their information. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me screen share.